Hello aviators, Sky here, and I'm passionate about aviation. What a reveal. I'm also fascinated by ships, and if you combine these two industries, you get these. Aircraft carriers. Big, complex, cool, and very strict about service regulations. But engineers and aviators are like that, always wanting to try something unusual, and sometimes even on strict floating airfields can happen stranger things. Today we'll be looking at stories that began with a captain asking, "What is that doing on my ship?" The first story is obviously the most famous, and it began with the appearance of B-25 bombers on the deck of the USS Hornet aircraft carrier in 1942. This was the Doolittle Raid at the height of World War II. The idea of an air attack on Tokyo arose almost immediately after the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor. The people were thirsty for revenge. The problem was that it was impossible to get to Tokyo. The planes did not have enough range, and there were no accessible airfields nearby. And then the idea arose to lift the planes not from airfields, but from an aircraft carrier that came close enough. The operation was entrusted to Lieutenant Colonel Harold James Doolittle, after whom, in fact, the raid was later named. The B-25 Mitchell was an obvious choice. The newest bomber was powerful and compact enough. But it wasn't designed for carrier operations and still lacked range. Thus began the saga of tuning. All non-critical components and systems, most of the armor and weapons were removed, leaving only the bombs, and the freed-up pounds were used to increase fuel capacity. They headed toward Japan with an escort, protected by the aircraft carrier USS Enterprise, maintaining radio silence, hoping not to be spotted. They were spotted. The fog of war had lifted, and it was clear the enemy would soon mobilize its defenses, or even begin hunting the carrier group. It was too early to take off, however. Japan was 650 miles away, a bit too far, but they didn't cancel the operation, deciding to take a risk and start earlier. Thus, on the morning of April 18th, 16 aircraft took off from the Hornet with a takeoff range of just 467 feet of deck length, significantly shorter than the typical B-25 takeoff. They took off quite successfully. They then flew a sweep over Japan, striking primarily military targets in Tokyo, as well as Yokohama, Yokosuka, Nagoya, Kobe, and Osaka. The element of surprise worked. The Japanese were unprepared for the attack, and the bombers got off with a haphazard anti-aircraft fire. Problems arose later. It was immediately clear that the B-25s wouldn't be able to return to the carrier. They simply wouldn't be able to land. So, after flying over the islands, they were supposed to head for China. But then, a deviation from the mission's starting point became apparent. The aircraft, almost out of fuel, at night and in terrible weather, barely made it to the mainland and not even where they were expected, and made emergency landings. The return home was a whole story, with the help of the Chinese and the fight against Japanese. It sounds so unusual nowadays. One plane managed to land on Soviet territory, which officially was not at war with Japan, so the pilots were formally interned and then sent home via Iran, claiming they had escaped. The B-25s flew on average about 2,250 miles, twice the standard range. Of the 80 crew members, 69 ultimately returned home. The results of the raid are difficult to describe. In purely military terms, Japan suffered no significant damage, and the risk, coupled with the loss of 16 bombers, didn't seem to be worth it. But the raid's morale and political impact are another matter. Americans' morale soared. The Japanese command, shocked by such a brazen attack, bolstered the defense of its homeland, returning part of its navy and air force to the rear. And who knows what the outcome of subsequent naval battles would have been if these forces had remained on the front lines. Many believe that the rise of the United States in the war began on the deck of the aircraft carrier Hornet, and the Doolittle Raid first went to the newspaper headlines and then the history books. In memory of the raid, there were even a couple of reenactments of B-25 takeoffs from aircraft carrier decks in the 1990s. But instead of the Hornet, it was the USS Ranger and USS Carl Vinson, and given their size, I imagine these takeoffs weren't quite so extreme. Of course, the carriers were moored off the California coast, and no one bombed anyone. Also, the name of the new American bomber can be considered a tribute to the raid and its participants. Why did you think the B-21 is called Raider? The Doolittle Raid also had another outcome. Aircraft carriers had finally proven their key role in naval warfare, and this upheaval gave rise to a certain confusion. According to regulations, each ship has its own air wing with a clearly defined list of assigned combat aircraft. But in the heat of battle, due to fatigue or navigational problems, there are times when pilots get confused and land on the wrong carrier. According to protocol, in the event of such an incident, the aircraft carrier's crew is supposed to accept the lost aircraft, prepare it, and send it home. But the aircraft is not theirs, so sometimes, after fulfilling the formal requirements, the crew would leave their guests a memento. There were even more absurd situations. In May 1942, the Battle of the Coral Sea broke out, the first direct clash between two carrier groups in history. After yet another skirmish in the air, fighters from both sides scattered to their carriers, one of which was the USS Yorktown. Yorktown was conducting standard checkpoint and landing operations for its air wing, comprised of the F-4F Wildcat fighters. But during yet another moment of this routine, the crew noticed that some of the Wildcats don't really look like Wildcats. They were Aichi Type 99 bombers, Japanese. The pilots were so tired that, disoriented, they confused not only ships, but entire fleets. The Americans, by the way, weren't amused. The planes with red circles overhead were a real worry. After all, they could pretend to be friendly, quietly approach the ships, and then suddenly bomb or torpedo them. That sounded like a plan. Naturally, the Japanese came under heavy fire, and the situation was made worse by the fact that in the kill zone there were also Americans, unaware of the situation and wondering why the hell their own ships were firing on them. This was no less of a surprise for the Japanese, and under fire from anti-aircraft guns, machine guns, and a barrage of obscenities on the radio, they miraculously managed to escape, heading off in search of, if not their own, then at least Japanese aircraft carriers. The end of World War II eased tensions at sea, but the aircraft carriers' adventures didn't end. In 1946, a US Navy task force was sent on an expedition to the shores of Antarctica. The mission, Operation High Jump, involved training in extreme conditions and assessing the fleet's capabilities to support polar stations and bases. It also sparked a slew of conspiracy theories about them supposedly searching for either a secret German base or aliens. The flagship of the force was the aircraft carrier USS Philippine Sea, whose air wing was supplemented by exotics, 6 R4D transport aircraft, naval modifications of the good old C-47 Skytrain, which naturally were not originally designed for aircraft carriers. For operations in ice, the aircraft were equipped with ski landing gears, and for takeoffs from the deck, with jet-assisted takeoff boosters. The aircraft were too heavy to accelerate on the short runway as usual, so their takeoffs were accompanied by a dazzling pyrotechnic display. The aircraft performed remarkably well, flying between polar stations, transporting cargo, and conducting aerial photography. However, like the Doolittle Raiders, they were unable to return to the carrier, so once they took off from the ship, they operated on the ice. And when Operation High Jump concluded, all 6 machines remained there. At the time, the R4Ds were the largest planes ever deployed on an aircraft carrier. And in 1947, the time had come for something truly exotic: rockets. Competing with the Army and Air Force for strategic potential, the Navy sought ways to use ballistic missiles from its ships, and its experiments were sometimes unusual. As part of Operation Sandy, the US Navy delivered to the aircraft carrier USS Midway a V-2 rocket, the same one whose brothers had attacked England a couple of years earlier. Midway was ideally suited for this. It was large enough to accommodate the big rocket, equipment, and personnel, and its armored deck ensured that the launches wouldn't burn through it. The carrier arrived at the launch site near Bermuda, after which the rocket was installed on a makeshift launch pad right on the deck. It looked strange, but it went according to plan. The test was extreme. Almost immediately after launch, the rocket tilted sharply on one side, and there was a risk it would crash onto the ship. Drama didn't occur. The V-2 leveled out and went up, but soon lost control anyway, and after rising to an altitude of several kilometers, broke apart and fell into the ocean. Yes, it wasn't a very reliable or precision-guided weapon. Incidentally, the test was considered a success. The disappointing results were offset by the substantial amount of useful data the engineers managed to collect. Nevertheless, the missile crews were quickly chased off the ship, as launching ballistic missiles isn't exactly a carrier's thing. And the next, pushover experiment, involved rehearsing a deck accident scenario involving a missile capsizing and exploding. For some reason, the sailors were reluctant to blow up their own carrier, so the experiment was conducted on a land-based deck simulator. This entire fireworks parade ultimately had its effect. The Navy later received its own missiles, which are now the backbone of the US strategic arsenal, and takeoffs and landings from floating platforms have, in our time, gained a certain popularity. The following story rekindled the love of hauling big birds onto aircraft carriers. In the 1950s, the US Navy acquired the USS Forrestal. Forrestal wasn't just a new carrier, it was the first of the super class, with a new layout, catapults and enormous dimensions. 240 feet longer and 4 times heavier than the carrier Hornet, from which the Doolittle Raiders took off. And of course the sailors wanted to put something big on it. The role of something big went to the C-130. Hercules is a medium-sized turboprop transport, a true legend in its class, remaining the master of hundreds of airfields around the world thanks to its flexibility and excellent takeoff and landing performance. But land-based airfields are one thing. For an aircraft carrier, the 85,000-pound transport was a huge and heavy monster. This monster flew to the flagship in 1963, and it worked. The Hercules not only successfully took off from the carrier, but also landed back. Yes, the aircraft had been slightly modified, lightened, and its brakes were reinforced, but nevertheless, the big guy did all this dozens of times with various payloads, even without the use of catapults and arresting gear. To this day, the C-130 is considered the heaviest aircraft ever to operate from an aircraft carrier. Nevertheless, it never went beyond experiments. The C-130 wasn't suitable for standard carrier duty. It was at a minimum too large, the deck had to be cleared of other machines for its operation, and it wouldn't fit in a hangar. Ultimately, the experiment was conducted out of scientific curiosity, and in practice, the C-2 Greyhound, specially designed for this purpose, soon began performing similar transport operations. The next character to appear on an aircraft carrier was even more exotic. Dragon Lady, the legendary U-2 spy plane. And not as an experiment, but for real work. Okay, at first it really was an experiment. The CIA, the proud owner of the U-2, was looking for a way to increase the aircraft's range, and Lockheed assumed that their brainchild could very well operate on a ship. This wouldn't increase the range per se, but it would allow them to move the launch point. In 1963, around the same time that Forrestal was testing the C-130, the CIA initiated Project Whaletail, the purpose of which was to practice the U-2 takeoffs and landings on the deck. This time the deck was provided by the USS Kitty Hawk, another cutting-edge supercarrier. The first takeoff was successful. The U-2 is essentially a jet glider. Its takeoff speed is low, and if you point the carrier into the wind and accelerate it, a short takeoff run is needed. The landing, however, was less successful. The U-2 is essentially a jet glider, with a huge wingspan and slightly rough controls, so the plane landed hard, slammed its wing into the deck, and nearly fell overboard. The aircraft were modified, with spoilers and tailhooks installed, and their landing gear reinforced, creating the U-2G version. The pilots also underwent retraining. Most of them had served in the Air Force before joining the CIA, and had never worked on aircraft carriers. The second chapter of the Whale Tales began in March 1964, this time on the aircraft carrier USS Ranger. And now everything was going relatively smoothly. There were a few hiccups, but the problems were quickly resolved and the missions were given the green light. However, only one real mission was given, Operation Seeker in 1964, when the spy plane took off from the aircraft carrier and flew to the Mururoa Atoll in French Polynesia, where obviously the French were preparing to conduct nuclear tests. They managed to film the preparations, but the U-2 didn't see any fireworks. The first charge there didn't detonate until 1966. The Dragon Lady's adventures at sea didn't end there. With the introduction of the U-2R, the aircraft's range and capabilities increased, although it became much larger, but Lockheed attempted to compensate with a folding wing mechanism. This time, in 1969, the crew of the USS America had to toil with the U-2. And the tests were successful. It turned out that the tailhook was not even needed for landing, and thanks to the folding wing, the aircraft could even be shoved into a hangar. However, then, a conceptual problem emerged. The U-2 is an aircraft carrying out secret missions, and if these missions involve a huge aircraft carrier with its own strike group, it's quite difficult to hide. The Navy and Lockheed toyed with additional features for a while, but ultimately abandoned the projects. They were too expensive and complicated the work of other carrier-based aircraft. There was no real need for them. Reconnaissance was eventually left to satellites and ground-based aircraft. They didn't dare land the SR-71 on the ship. The Pentagon didn't have whiskey that strong. The final story is the opposite of practice of using heavy, oversized planes on aircraft carriers. This time, it was a small one. In the spring of 1975, the Vietnam War was drawing to a close. The United States was evacuating personnel and loyal Vietnamese to its ships standing nearby. Saigon was already about to fall, so the evacuation was noisy and chaotic. Naturally, there wasn't enough room for everyone. South Vietnamese Air Force Major Buang Le decided to take a different approach. He had access to a Cessna 01 Bird Dog, a light piston-engine aircraft used for reconnaissance, spotter, communication, and other missions. Buang Le's idea was that the aircraft, with short takeoff and landing capabilities, could take off without a long runway, reach the American fleet, and land on an aircraft carrier. Except the Bird Dog was a single-seater, two-seater if you really tried, and besides the pilot, he needed room for his wife and 5 children. Miraculously, the bird, loaded with the entire family, managed to take off and fly to the rendezvous point. Another problem was that no one in the fleet was actually expecting him, and the crew of the aircraft carrier USS Midway didn't immediately understand why this mosquito was hovering overhead. After circling the ship several times, Buang Le managed to drop a note, informing them of his large family, low fuel supply, and the request to be taken on board. One more problem arose. The deck was filled with evacuation helicopters, and there was no room to land. An order came through, the execution of which brings sadness to aviators. Immediately clear the deck. Any equipment that can't be moved, throw overboard. Thus, 1 Chinook and 4 Hueys ended up in the sea. It all ended happily. The little Bird Dog is no B-25 or C-130, and despite the pilot's lack of experience on aircraft carriers, after several test approaches he managed to land successfully. The Cessna once again proved its sometimes unusual capabilities. Incidentally, another Cessna landed in the middle of Moscow in the 1980s. Nowadays, sailors and aviators of course try to avoid any extremes. Some would say they've become more professional, while others would complain that they've become dull. However, some unusual things, albeit on a smaller scale, do occasionally happen on deck. Subscribe to the channel to stay up to date with new stories, fast flights in more standard conditions, and soft landings to you.